that we think the Conservatives are certainly at risk of suffering a serious defeat. I shared a panel with James Kanagasuriam, who's the person who invented the Red Wall, and Matt Singh, who is the person who spotted that the polls might be wrong in 2015. And between a few days ago, and between us, we agreed that any figure for the Conservatives between 50 and 150 was potentially credible. This isn't just simply to do with what share of the vote the Conservatives are going to get, which in the opinion polls on average at the moment, and we'll get a forest of them, I suspect, in the next 24 hours, is running at about 20%, actually slightly more than that in the so-called mega polls. So that's obviously a problem for the Conservatives. But that, in theory, could still leave them with about 200 seats. The problem is, and what we're uncertain about, is the extent to which the Conservative seat vote is actually going to fall more heavily in places where they were previously strongest. Some of that is certainly bound to happen simply because there are around 100 constituencies where the Conservative vote cannot fall by the 25 points to which the polls on average point, because they didn't have 25% in those constituencies last time.
Yes.
That's point number one. And point number two is it's pretty clear, because the Brexit Party did not contest Conservative-held seats in 2019, that Reform are going to do most damage to the Conservatives in the very places they're trying to hang on. And you see this in very different estimates in the mega polls as to whether or not indeed the Tories are going to end up with 50 or 150. They differ in terms of the strength of the relationship that they're anticipating between the size of the fall in Conservative support and the level of Conservative support in the past.
Yes.
On average, however, those polls are saying that perhaps the Conservatives will end up with around 100, which therefore means that Frank is, if anything, very slightly on the optimistic side as compared with the average of the mega polls.
Interesting. Now, John, I realise you are a scientist and not a clairvoyant, but a couple of times now you've mentioned that range of possible Conservative Party strength in the next House of Commons as between 50 and 150. Does that seem to you to be in your water, as it were, to be the most likely realistic range?
Yeah, I mean, this is the range within which is undoubtedly most likely to fall, unless the polls are really significantly overestimating Labour's lead over the Conservatives. I think certainly, given history, we wouldn't be entirely surprised if there was a bit of an exaggeration of the lead. But so long as that's no more of the order of 2, 3, 4 points, then something in that range seems at least possible, though if the polls are somewhat wrong, then maybe towards the upper end of that range.
Right, so but even at the top end of that range, that would still amount to an absolutely crushing defeat. Now, as for the Prime Minister saying 130,000 votes in marginal seats could have a huge effect on the outcome in Parliament, there's truth in that, isn't there?
Yeah, sure.
But that doesn't mean we're watching a close fight, curiously.
No, well, the reason why that's the case is that if indeed we are right in anticipating that the Conservative vote is going to fall most heavily in places where they are previously strongest, that will in effect mean that we have many more seats that are marginal between Conservative and Labour, and indeed between Conservative and Liberal Democrats, than would otherwise be the case. Again, that's one of the messages of those big mega polls, that an awful lot of constituencies could end up on one side or the other of the line as a result of relatively small shifts in the votes, which again is yet another reason for the uncertainty. The uncertainty doesn't seem to be about the winner. The uncertainty is about what happens in terms of parliamentary representation.
Yes.
And, given the vagaries of the single-member party system, it requires an accurate estimate of what's going to happen in 632 entirely separate contests.
Yes.
And with the best will of the world and the best scientists in the world, that is a very, very difficult task.
How far will turnout, or could turnout, affect the result? Because that could be a very significant factor when it comes to looking at where the result falls in a range of possibilities.
Well, it could, but it's only if you believe that the motivation for one side to turn out and vote is markedly greater or less than that of another side. I suspect that all the parties will have something of a struggle to get people to turn out and vote, simply because A, the poll says it's all over by the shouting, B, the Labour's move to the centre means that there's not a great deal of difference between the parties. Add to that the fact that none of our party leaders really have enthused the electorate, though I've heard your interesting conversation about Sir Ed Davey. And meanwhile, we know that there's fairly widespread distrust of politicians in general. Put all that together, and it does seem as though we've got a recipe for many a voter to say, well, to be honest, it's not really worth the shoe leather. And of course, the difficulties with the postal votes won't have helped the turnout either. So, whether we'll be as low as the 59% in 2001, who knows? But I would be surprised if we ended up with the 68, 69% we've had in recent elections. But that could simply mean that both Labour and Conservative voters feel somewhat less impelled to go to the polls than perhaps they would have been a few years ago.
Yeah, but given, I suppose, the Conservative Party in particular, their predicament, the warnings about a supermajority, they made our eyebrows shoot up when we first heard that apparent concession of doom on the way for the Tories. But perhaps it works. It maybe has made a difference. It makes sense. From a campaigning point of view.
It does if you think that people are concerned that the Conservative Party may be about to be treated rather unfairly by the electoral system. But you have to remember that at the end of the day, no voter has control over the electoral system. We all faithfully cast our individual votes, but frankly, it's within the geography created by the boundary commissions as to what our votes actually end up meaning. And none of us can really be fully in charge of that. And secondly, quite a lot of evidence out there that quite a lot of voters feel that the Conservative Party do actually deserve a bit of a drubbing, and therefore I think we could exaggerate and that includes many a person who voted Conservative in 2019. I think we could seriously exaggerate the extent to which voters are sitting there and saying, well, I know the Conservatives haven't done a terribly good job. I really am rather disenchanted with them, but I'm still going to vote for them because I want them to be in opposition and I want them to be effective.
Really interesting. Your thoughts on what's going on through those target voters' minds. Now, look, when we look at reform, they are now around 4 points behind in the polls, the generality of the polls. We're going to end up in another situation. I know this is more politics than science, John. We're going to end up in another situation where we see one of those upstart parties landing millions of votes and a tiny number of seats. But this time, we can expect, can't we, more of a discussion, a debate, an inquest on our anciently established first past the post voting system.
That's certainly perfectly conceivable, and at the moment it looks as though Labour might get 40%, even slightly less than that of the vote, and could get 70% of the seats. Oh, the Liberal Democrats, by the way, who usually lose out, some of the projections suggest they might get around 10, 11% of the vote and around 10 or 11% of the seats. So they might be a little less grumpy than in the past, but the Conservatives look as though they're going to lose out seriously. Certainly if, as we were talking about earlier, we were towards the lower end of that estimate. Reform are going to lose out, the Greens are going to lose out, maybe the SNP lose out a bit. And certainly, I mean, if you take the average of the mega polls in terms of votes and seats, we could well indeed be heading for the most disproportional electoral outcome ever. It's just that the winners and losers from the system are perhaps rather different from what we've usually talked about. Usually, often those on the left feel that Labour and the Democrats lose out from the system and the Conservatives gain. Well, I think the shoe is going to be on the other foot this time around. Yes, I think we're going to have a discussion, but where it will go, I'm not sure where it will go, because although the Labour Party is officially in favour of changing the electoral system to proportional representation, Sir Keir Starmer has never taken up the idea, and I think the enthusiasm of many Labour activists for proportional representation will disappear as rapidly as it did in 1997, when the party never thought it could win a dramatic overall majority, and then when it got one of 170 odd, while we had the commission from Roy Jenkins, it never ever got put to the electorate.